Welcome to the Northway Podcast, the first long-form, deep-dive history podcast focused exclusively on the Viking Age. I am your host, Henry Holst, and for those that didn't listen to the short introduction episode, what you are about to hear is the story before the story of who the Scandinavians are and where they came from and how they came to be in Scandinavia. And if this seems like we're setting the foundation super deep here for a story about the Viking Age, well, this is relevant to us because, if you don't know, the Scandinavians of the Viking Age will be among the very last peoples in Europe to believe in the very old pre-Christian pagan gods, which are part of a belief system and worldview that stretched back thousands and thousands of years. And conflicts between believers of these very old gods and the medieval Christian world is part of what will light the fuse on the Viking Age itself. And so, to understand how things began, well, you have to understand where they began, right? And so our purpose for the first few episodes will be to build the world as it was on the eve of the Viking Age. So that said, strap in and welcome to the Norse world of Midgard. Every society since the dawn of our species has come up with stories to answer the fundamental question of who we are and where we came from. For example, the ancient Greeks believed their fire god Prometheus had shaped humanity from clay, while the Maya believed their gods had made humanity from a dough made from ground corn, while the Norse believed that Odin created the first two humans from pieces of ash wood and elm wood that had washed up on the shore of a primordial world that was formed from the body of a slain giant. And while we might look down on these worldviews and see them as primitive, it is understandable, isn't it? Because don't we all have an intrinsic desire to know the answer to that question of who we are and where we came from in order to make sense of all of this? But it might surprise you to learn that, until recently, we could only make educated guesses on trying to answer these questions. Strong ones, based on the archaeological evidence, but still guesses at where various peoples came from and how they came to be where they are today. But all this changed in the early 2000s when humanity finally figured out how to extract DNA from ancient remains, specifically from within the interior of the hard enamel of adult teeth, which protected enough bits of DNA from deterioration across the millennia that we can now use it to reconstruct ancient genomes, something that we now call archaeogenetics. And the first full genomes from humanity's deep past were reconstructed in 2010, and our knowledge and awareness has been increasing rapidly ever since. And folks, this DNA evidence helps tell the story of who the Scandinavians are and where they came from and what they looked like, and along with the rest of archaeology, gives insight into how they and everyone else came to be in Northern Europe. And the story that it tells us is one that is simultaneously incredible but absolutely gut-wrenching to behold. It's one of those things that I ask myself if I could somehow watch it on video. I'm not entirely sure I would, and I say that as a massive history nerd. And this is often the case for military history topics. All military history enthusiasts know deep down that the reason various wars or battles are interesting to us rather than revolting is because we're viewing them from a safe distance, right? It's kind of like how we're all fans of the Roman Legion. You pull a random guy off the street and ask him what he finds interesting about the Legion, and you'll probably hear about the Legion's engineering, or maybe its logistics, or the cool legionary armor, or the gladius or testudo. But what you probably almost certainly won't hear are guys talking about how much they loved how effective the Legion was at shoving swords into other men's bellies. And even if you find someone who finds that exciting, well, that's a rare person who could watch that on video and not be hugely impacted by it. But make no mistake, that is exactly what the Legion did. That is why it existed. And they did it so well that Rome carved out the largest empire that Europe has ever seen. And I say these things because when viewed from afar, the topic we're about to get into, of which the origin story of the Scandinavians is part of, is kind of like that. It is simultaneously one of humanity's most incredible stories of conquest about the spread of a people and their culture and language, so mind-boggling in scale, stretching across half the world and lasting for thousands of years, that many people around the world are still coming to grips with the fact that it is real and it actually happened. But when viewed up close, this is also a story of extraordinary violence and predatory aggression. And what's interesting about this story is that it was entirely forgotten by humanity for thousands of years. I thought about starting this episode with a play on the Lord of the Rings introduction bit, where Galadriel says, "History became legend, and legend became myth, and for 2,500 years the ring passed out of all knowledge." Because that is exactly what happened. These conquests that I'm talking to here began 5,000 years ago and lasted for so long that humanity's memory of them had passed out of all knowledge. And kind of like the One Ring, this event was rediscovered by the most unlikely of creatures. That is, a British philologist, which is a term that refers to a person that studies languages, named Sir William Jones in the late 1700s in Calcutta, India. And kind of like Gollum finding the One Ring, the rediscovery of this story would contribute to the largest war that humanity has ever fought. So, our story begins in the late 1700s in India, which at the time was ruled by the British East India Company by charter from the British Crown, an arrangement that effectively made India into a British colonial possession. And one of the headaches with this arrangement was that it meant that the British had to simultaneously govern their merchants and the native Indians and disagreements between them. And this meant that the British sometimes had to render judgments based off Hindu law. But the problem was that Hindu legal texts were written in an ancient language that hadn't been commonly spoken in over 2,000 years, called Sanskrit. And the British couldn't just ask Indian lawyers to translate Sanskrit for them, because that would erode the legitimacy of the judge in the court system, right? And so for the British to stand up a functional court and thus enable British rule in India, they needed an Englishman to learn Sanskrit. And so they sent Sir William Jones, philologist, student of languages, to India to learn Sanskrit so that he could create a functional and legitimate court and thus maintain the highly profitable stability that the British wanted. But when Jones got to Calcutta and started learning Sanskrit, he noticed something that he hadn't expected. That there were many words that looked and sounded remarkably similar to their meanings in Latin and Greek, languages that he was already deeply familiar with. And forgive me if my pronunciation is a bit off here, but consider the word for mother. In Sanskrit, it is matar. In Latin, it's mater. And in Greek, it's mater. And then you have the word for father. In Sanskrit, it is pitter. In Latin, pater. And in Greek, pater. And then you have the word for is or to be, which in Sanskrit is asti. In Latin, est. And in Greek, esti. Now, take a step back and imagine what it was like to be William Jones. Maybe sitting in some quiet, candlelit study in Calcutta, expecting to see an alien language looking at him from out of the pages, and instead looking at words that sounded familiar to him. And if Jones knew what his discovery would eventually unleash, I do wonder whether he would have done what he did next, because he wrote home, and he proposed that a single ancient proto-language lay beneath not only the languages of Europe and the Middle East, but also Sanskrit. And that based on his reading of the Sanskrit texts, he believed that Sanskrit had been introduced to India via an invasion by a people that, in the Sanskrit texts, called themselves a term many of you will be familiar with. They called themselves Aryans. Now, academics were as cutthroat then as they are now, and Jones' theory was challenged throughout Europe because what he was proposing was inconvenient for many of the growing nationalist movements in Europe in the 1800s, because it undermined the idea that various countries had unique, distinct national identities. But Jones had baited a hook that couldn't be resisted, because the evidence was there for all to see. There were just too many word similarities from ancient cultures that developed in areas so far removed from one another. And so, as research intensified throughout the 1800s, it slowly became clear that there was an ancient proto-language that underpinned everything from Celtic and Latin and Greek, among many others, stretching all the way to India and Nepal. Academics coined this language, quote, Proto-Indo-European. It was an extinct language with no living speakers, but was accepted as having existed in the deep past, and that the language had evolved as its speakers conquered and migrated across Eurasia. Over time, adding words and changing pronunciations, all part of a process that linguists now call drift, with Proto-Indo-European slowly drifting into new languages, and those languages then drifting and splitting again and again and again. And if you're a visual person like me who likes to look at things as well as just hear about them, I've uploaded several images of this, and the easiest way to access these will be on my Twitter profile. My username is the Northway Pod, in a post in the highlights section with this episode title, as well as my profile on podbean.com. That's pod as in P-O-D and bean, Podbean, which can be found by Googling the Northway Podcast, no spaces, and Podbean, all free to access. And if you can pull it up, the image is creatively labeled Image 1. And for those that can't, this image uses the analogy of a huge tree to speak to and explain the spread of Proto-Indo-European and its drift process in creating new languages. So the trunk of the tree is labeled Proto-Indo-European, and the large branches that branch off from it are its regional variants. For example, on the European branch, Proto-Indo-European turned into the ancient Germanic and Slavic and Italic and Albanian and Baltic and Celtic languages, eventually becoming languages we're familiar with in the modern day, like English and Dutch and the Scandinavian languages, and everything from Greek and Armenian to things like French, Polish, Russian, Bulgarian. The list goes on and on. You probably get the picture. And then on the Indo-Iranian branch, this language drifted not only into Iranian, but most of the main languages of South Asia, like Pashto and Kurdish, to Hindi, Bengali, Punjabi, Nepali, and a much, much longer list of lesser-known languages I can barely pronounce the name of. And so take a step back here and consider what it must have felt like for academics like Jones to realize what he was looking at as he turned the pages of different language dictionaries in front of him, comparing word pronunciations and gradually realizing the immense, titanic implications of what he was looking at. Because, folks, the sheer existence of a proto-language that spread this far hints that something huge, something immensely huge, had happened in the deep past. Something before things were written down by anybody. Something that, like the One Ring, had been forgotten and become legend and then become myth and then had passed out of all knowledge for thousands of years. Because a single proto-language whose words and syntax and grammar form the root of half the world's surviving languages that over 3 billion people speak in the modern day doesn't just happen on a whim. And we begin with this story because it was the speakers of this language, carrying their culture and belief systems with them, that were the last of the major human migrations into Northern Europe and Scandinavia. And I use the term major because while people are always moving around in their various small ways on a regional level, it was these Indo-European speaking peoples that were the last major outside group, as in having a fundamentally different language and religion and culture, to take most of the region by conquest, and in doing so, replace the majority of the people living there. And so this means that these Indo-European speaking peoples, specifically the subgroup of them that took Northern Europe, and more specifically the group that entered Scandinavia, are the people that will become the target subjects of this podcast series. At the same time, everyone else this podcast will talk about will speak a language and have a historical religion and culture that is largely rooted in their Indo-European past. And like we spoke about at the beginning, we also start with this story because the Viking Age is one of the last stands of the very, very old Indo-European gods in Europe. Because while Norse paganism will be subject to the same drift process that the language was, changing over time, by the time of the Viking Age, these Indo-European belief systems that had once entirely dominated Europe will have been pushed back by Christianity and Islam to Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. And friction between believers of these very old gods and the medieval Christian world will, in large part, be the match that lights the fuse on the Viking Age itself. And so it's worth starting with the speakers of this proto-language and exploring where they came from and how they came to be in Scandinavia, because the Norse didn't just thaw out of the ice or sprout from the ground with their pagan belief systems preloaded in their heads. Rather, they took Scandinavia by force, and they brought their language and belief systems with them. Now, while the jury is still out on where these people initially came from, their origin being one of the great unsolved questions in Western Civ, the currently prevailing thesis is called the steppe hypothesis. The word steppe referring to a huge stretch of grassland, very similar in appearance to the American prairie, that runs about 4,000 miles from Mongolia across Central Asia into Hungary and Central Europe. And proponents of the steppe hypothesis use some super in-depth linguistic analysis to place the Indo-European homeland in a section of the steppe around southern Ukraine and Russia called the Pontic-Caspian Steppe. For the curious, I've uploaded a map of this region, see image 2, on my X profile and the Podbean site. But for those that can't see it, this area stretches from the land north of the Black Sea eastward to the land north of the Caspian Sea. Archaeologists have dubbed the original speakers of Proto-Indo-European the, quote, Yamnaya culture. Culture here being an archaeological term for people that have similar stuff like pottery. And the majority consensus right now is that 5,500 years ago in 3500 BC, some 3,500 years before people like Jesus and Caesar would walk the earth, that the Yamnaya had a common language and religion and way of life and similar stuff like pottery and other things, as well as distinct physical characteristics, while also being identifiable on a genetic level, that all combined to make the Yamnaya into a cohesive, discernible group or people. So when I use the term Yamnaya, from now on, I'm going to be referring to this group on the Pontic-Caspian Steppe. And when I use the term Indo-European, I'm going to be referring to these people's descendant groups. Groups that split off from this ancestral group in the Pontic-Caspian Steppe, but kept much of its societal practices, language, and religion. Okay, so around 3500 BC, someone probably in Central Europe or Mesopotamia invented a wagon that could be hitched to draft animals. And as far as we know, this was the first animal-powered wheeled vehicle on Earth. And not to belabor the obvious point here, but this was a huge deal because it suddenly made it possible for draft animals to move heavy things. And while wagons were useful to farming peoples because they could now move heavy things around the farm more easily, it was absolutely world-changing technology for the Yamnaya, because the wagon was like the golden key that unlocked the door to an almost unlimited source of fat and protein. To understand this, remember that the steppe is basically a giant ocean of grass which can grow up to 5 feet tall during the summer. So for people with cattle and sheep, and by this time domesticated horses as well, this likely being where the horse was domesticated, this huge ocean of grass represented food, an almost endless, titanic amount of food that their livestock could eat, in which they in turn could get nutrient-dense meat and dairy products from. But the problem was that without the wagon, they couldn't access most of this ocean of grass because the steppe is an inhospitable land of extremes. For beginners, there are no trees there outside of the areas adjacent to the few rivers that snake their way across this landscape, and so devoid of anything to slow it down, the winds rip across the grassland. And worse, because the grassland lacks large bodies of water, there's nothing to modulate the temperatures, meaning that the steppe experiences extreme temperature fluctuations throughout the day. And worse, during the winter, cold winds full of snow and ice blow down from the Arctic, while during the summer it gets incredibly hot. And so without the wagon, the Yamnaya couldn't bring shelter and tools out onto the steppe with them, meaning that they were restricted to a tiny sliver of the grasslands around the river systems. But this limitation disappears when you add the wagon to this dynamic. And by the way, I've uploaded a picture of one of these wagons, titled Image 3 for the curious. In his book, The Horse, the Wheel, and Language, archaeologist David Anthony talks about how the moment these wagons are detected in the Pontic-Caspian Steppe, the riverside settlements that had shown signs of human habitation for millennia disappear virtually overnight, meaning that this entire people took off into the grasslands and adopted an almost entirely mobile, on-the-go way of life, living in large, lightweight tents made from tightly pressed wool that is then soaked in fat to make it waterproof, a product we now call felt, and it's thought that they burned manure from their livestock to stave off the cold inside these tents during winter. This was the first time that anyone on Earth had ever been able to live life in this way, a way of life we now call pastoral nomadism, where one lives life almost entirely on the move. And folks, again, not to state the obvious here, but this is a really rough way to live. Because just take one struggle, for example, that of women carrying children to term and giving birth and then raising them in an environment where they are bouncing around in wagons every day as the family moves to keep up with its herds as they mow their way through this ocean of grass, all while being surrounded by the dry environment of extreme heat, cold, and wind that we spoke about earlier. And it's shortly after adopting this new way of life that archaeologists are confident that the Yamnaya's outward expansion began. And while they expanded in many different directions, the ones most relevant to us are their expansion vectors into Europe, which are believed to have been done by two groups. Archaeologists call one of them the, quote, corded ware culture, so called for the distinctive pottery style that is found wherever they went, while the other is usually just called the southeastern Yamnaya. The corded ware, for context, are believed to have departed the Pontic steppe in a northwesterly direction, moving through modern-day Belarus and Poland before skirting the south of the Baltic Sea westward until they arrived in northern Germany, with an offshoot of the corded ware we now call the battle axe culture being the group that entered Scandinavia. And the southeastern Yamnaya, by contrast, are believed to have taken a southwestern exit from the Pontic steppe. I know that sounds a bit weird. The gist here is that they left the Pontic steppe in a southwesterly direction before arriving in southeastern Europe, hence the name Southeastern Yamnaya, and this path saw them move through Bulgaria and follow the Danube westward through modern-day Serbia and Hungary before stopping in the Balkans, with the rest of Western Europe, northern Italy and Spain and France and the British Isles, later being taken over by an Indo-European group called the Bell-Beaker culture. A lot of terms here, but Bell-Beaker was a new group that resulted from the corded ware group mixing with European farmers. And their name refers to the distinctive drinking cups we find wherever they went. And now, we'll get into genetics later, but for now, just know that the corded ware were roughly 75% genetically Yamnaya, and the Bell-Beaker were about half. But both of these groups still spoke Indo-European languages and had Indo-European belief systems. And it was these Bell-Beaker people that carried Yamnaya DNA in the Indo-European language and culture and religion into Spain, France, and the British Isles, as well as northern Italy. Now, there is no single answer for why these groups were so overwhelmingly successful in waging war against the farming peoples living in Europe at this time around 3000 BC. People that archaeologists literally call European farmers, for the simple reason that they were farming peoples that lived in Europe. Because while Most of these European farmers were living in a Neolithic age at the time, around 3000 BC. Neolithic meaning a Stone Age. Stone Age doesn't mean simple, folks, because these aren't the primitive cave dwelling barbarians most people picture in their mind when they hear the term Stone Age. Quite the opposite. These people lived in complex and organized farming villages of up to several hundred people in some instances, with these villages sometimes having two-story homes and frequently being surrounded by palisades. All things that require a lot of social organization and planning. They farmed, they had cattle, they made beautiful pottery and jewelry that we have dug up. They just didn't have a lot of metalworking. So these are far from the stereotypical drooling caveman associated with the term Stone Age. Regardless, though, it is abundantly clear from the genetic evidence, as in who survived and who didn't, that they were completely outmatched by the Indo-Europeans. And again, there's no single answer that explains why. In my mind, a good way to think about this is kind of like how the University of Alabama's football team was so dominant for so long. And for those who don't know, the University of Alabama won the American College Football Championship pretty much every other year for over a decade, starting around 2008 or so. And there's no one single thing that caused this, because a lot of things go into a team with a track record of success that long. You have really good coaching from their coach, Nick Saban, but you also have a strong recruiting organization that consistently sourced the best players every year. And then you have harder to measure things, like how new players joining Alabama are practicing with the best players out there every day, creating a kind of culture of excellence that other teams might not have. Which of these are the most important? Take your pick. You take out any of them, and Alabama is still good, but altogether, Alabama becomes the best college football team in the U.S. for over a decade. To give a video game analogy here as well, to make sure that my analogy Venn diagram hits the entirety of the male demographic, the Amnaya are kind of like the faction in games like Civilization or Age of Empires that the developers mistakenly gave overwhelmingly one-sided advantages to, making said faction so powerful that anyone who doesn't pick them when they pick up the game and play gets destroyed by others in online PvP. The first of these advantages they had on everyone around them was the mobility they got from their horses, which they had a lot of, for the simple reason that having a ton of horses is one of the main perks you get for living the rough life of a pastoral nomad. And so we are talking about an incredibly mobile people here who can move very quickly across distances that farming peoples like our European farmers could only largely tackle on foot. Now, as of right now, it is not believed they fought on horseback during this push into Europe. Archaeologists like David Anthony lean towards a mounted infantry interpretation based on analysis of their weaponry, meaning that they likely fought dismounted. And while I know this might sound strange, keep in mind that many peoples throughout history have been like this. For example, this is how the Vikings would use horses in many theaters that they operated in. And even though they may not have been fighting on horseback, this mobility advantage was still a huge deal because when fighting a farming people who don't have tons of horses, it means that, barring getting ambushed, that the Indo-European groups couldn't really be forced into fights that they didn't want, for the simple reason that they could just ride away. And there are tons of examples throughout history of steppe nomadic armies and even whole tribes simply retreating in the face of infantry-based threats and denying them battle. And this also works the other way around, in the sense that the group with superior mobility can often force their enemy to fight on their terms, because they can attack at a time and place of their choosing. Because their enemy is slower and less mobile, it is harder for them to deny an engagement, because they'll literally have to turn and fight or get speared in the back. Now, this is obviously a simplification, and like we talked about, these European farmers did fortify their settlements, which gave them some ability to deny battle. But if one side can choose when they want to fight while denying battle whenever they don't feel the odds favor them, well, that is a huge deal, isn't it? Because just imagine being a Stone Age farmer trying to deal with people like this, not knowing whether the horsemen they saw a few days ago are hidden in the woods at the edge of the farm, waiting for you to lead your cattle out to pasture, or if they are 50 miles away causing someone else trouble. And if you and the rest of your fellow farmers band together to try and hunt them down, well, the Yamnaya can still deny battle, and worse, by being faster, they might be able to make it back to your village before you do, catching it defenseless. And this simple tactical reality was so challenging that later empires like the Assyrians and the many Chinese empires and many others would be pushed to their absolute limit and sometimes lose dealing with this same kind of problem. And if some of the most sophisticated empires in world history were hard pressed to deal with this, how do you think our Stone Age European farmers are going to handle it? And then there are other, less obvious advantages that the Yamnaya had on the European farmers. Things like the meat and dairy heavy diet they got in return for living the rough life of a pastoral nomad. Archaeogeneticist Wolfgang Hack, for instance, who works at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, found that after 3300 BC, roughly the time period when these people went full pastoral nomad, that Yamnaya teeth began to contain evidence of milk proteins from cows and sheep and goats and even horses. Yes, you heard that right. Horse milk. I came so close to calling this episode Horse Milk, but I was afraid of torpedoing the entire show at the onset. Someone opens up this show, hey, Viking Age History Podcast, Horse Milk. What? So tempting, though. Now, to be clear, these people were not yet lactose tolerant, meaning that at this time their stomachs couldn't effectively break down the lactose sugars in milk, meaning that while they certainly drank small amounts of milk, they likely processed most of it into cheese and yogurt or fermented milk, which is an alcoholic beverage, because all of these products have the benefit of having less lactose, which makes them more easily digestible while still having a lot of fat and protein. And this is hugely important for our story because fat and protein fuel muscle growth and strength building, as well as one's testosterone levels. And for children, fat and protein are critical enablers for reaching one's height potential. And so, while these people will eventually become lactose tolerant and be able to cut out the middleman and just drink the milk down the road, the key thing here is that pastoral nomadism put these people on the ancient equivalent of like a bulking diet. In our Age of Empires analogy, this protein and fat heavy diet combined with the vitality and strength one gets from living the rough life of a pastoral nomad gave these people the Age of Empires equivalent of like a unit health or strength bonus. And don't believe me, in his book, The Horse, the Wheel, and Language, archaeologist David Anthony's physical description of the Yamnaya begins by describing them as tall and strong. In one study I read found that they had the highest ever calculated genetic propensity for height of any ancient population ever tested. For example, their male skeletons that we found average around 5'10", that's 177 centimeters, which is about the same height as the average white male in the United States today. And if that doesn't sound super impressive, keep in mind that 5,000 years ago, this made them giants compared to the European farmers that we've been talking about, whose men averaged about 5'5" or 167 centimeters. And if you still don't think that's a big deal, well, I would say that you may not be fully appreciating the physical realities of fighting someone who's not only got strength, but also 5 inches of reach on you. The Yamnaya were consuming so much dairy that David Anthony found evidence of very high rates of childhood anemia in their skeletons, which, if you don't know, is an iron deficiency that develops when infants and toddlers consume too much dairy. It gives a whole new meaning to the phrase got milk, doesn't it? So pastoral nomadism has given this people a mobility advantage, along with a height and strength advantage. And then there are other, less immediately obvious benefits that pastoral nomadism gave these people. Things like better winter clothes. Now, for context here, it was around this time in 3000 BC that selective sheep breeding around the Caucasus Mountains, which border the Yamnaya homeland, resulted in a new kind of sheep with long hair fibers, creatively called the long-haired sheep. And these long hairs were a huge deal for humanity because it enabled people to weave wool into clothing for the first time, something that couldn't be done with the previous short-haired varieties of sheep. And as strange as it may sound, wool clothing was another big advantage these people had on the European farmers because, just like today, wool is the perfect fabric for cold weather. Because it's super insulating and keeps you warm in the cold, but more importantly, it can still do this even when it gets wet. Because when you weave wool into clothing, the dense structure of wool fibers resemble a tiny, complex labyrinth. So when it starts to rain and the surface of the wool gets wet, this intricate maze of wool fibers form tiny little air pockets that create an air gap that separates the body from the cold water on the surface of the wool, while at the same time, the wool wicks moisture off the skin, which helps keep the body warm by preventing sweat from sitting on the skin, which is important because liquids absorb heat and cold faster than air. Anyone who has ever felt the rush of cold when taking off a jacket outside during winter when you're a bit sweaty will be familiar with this effect. And if this sounds extremely boring, well, keep in mind that things like wool clothing have huge military implications because, at the risk of stating the obvious again, Europe is cold, folks. It rains and it snows a lot during winter, meaning that if you are outside, you're going to get wet. And so having clothing that still keeps you warm when wet is a big deal, especially when you take into account the fact that the European farmers were still wearing animal skins as clothes. Because leather, animal skins being leather, has almost the exact opposite effect of everything we just described. When it gets wet, for example, it absorbs more water than wool. And when it does this, this wet leather will stick to the skin, not only conducting heat away from the body, but also directly transferring cold outside temperatures onto the skin. And on top of all these performance differences is the fact that by living the pastoral nomadic way of life, the Indo-Europeans had a ton of sheep. Sheep that could produce this wool for clothing every year. While the European farmers not only had less animals per capita, but they could only create clothing from said animals once. And this matters because it means that one of these groups could operate much, much more easily in winter than the other. But the icing on the cake of this cold weather advantage is the fact that these Indo-European groups' horses were like the ancient equivalent of winter all-terrain vehicles. And this is something that's often overlooked in military history, that because horses are native to the brutally cold steppe, they are adapted to survive in brutally cold conditions. For those that don't know, they are the only farm animal that will instinctively kick away snow to access grass and use their hooves to break ice to access water on their own. And like the wool thing, while this sounds like it's not relevant at all, it means that horses can kind of look after themselves. And this is a great thing if you are a war party moving quickly during winter. It saves a lot of time. Everyone can get busy creating a makeshift shelter and getting a fire going while the horses can, somewhat, look after themselves. And so being able to quickly move across cold, snow-filled terrain, combined with the winter clothing, make these people far more adapted to winter than the European farmers ever were. And while there's no way for us to know this, if these Indo-European groups were anything like later steppe peoples, they may have purposely ridden mares, female horses, and drank their milk while on the move to simplify their logistical planning. Regardless of whether that was a thing or not, what we are looking at here is a people for whom distance and cold weather are not barriers. 50 miles of distance in January doesn't keep you safe from me, that kind of thing. And keep in mind with all this, that mobility and cold weather gear have always been a major element of fighting in Europe. History fans will probably be familiar with how the cold and lack of mobility led to massive losses among Napoleon's army as it retreated from Moscow in 1812. And then you have the Soviet invasion of Finland in 1939, whose army was defeated, in part, due to Finnish troops' winter clothing and use of skis, which they used to outmaneuver Soviet forces in the deep snow. And then, most famously, you have the German invasion of Russia in 1941, where their mobility and logistical issues heavily contributed to their defeat at Stalingrad. Now, I'm not implying that 5,000-year-old Indo-European war parties are better equipped than these groups, but rather that compared to the leather wearing, largely non mounted European farmers, that these Indo European groups had a massive advantage during winter. When you combine these things, you get what military planners today in DC call a revolution in military affairs, which is a term that refers to periods in human history where new doctrines, or tactics, or technologies lead to a permanent change in the conduct of warfare. Referring back to our Age of Empires analogy, this is like when the meta in a video game changes. Meta being a term that refers to when a new best set of practices appear that dominate a video game's competitive dynamic. And to use a sports analogy as well, so again, I'm capturing the entirety of the male demographic here, this is like when the NBA added the 3-point line in 1979. And then fast forward a few years, all the teams in the NBA rapidly realized that that was the thing to focus on. So they restructured everything from the way they recruited to the way they played on the court, all so they could make more 3-point attempts. And what we are looking at here with the Indo-Europeans is kind of like these things. Because, folks, this may have been the first major alteration to the norms of human warfare since the first Homo sapien made the first spear several 100,000 years ago. Now, one thing you will sometimes see added to this list of Indo-European advantages is bronze weaponry. And I mention this because bronze is one of those yes but no kinds of topics. Because while archaeologists find lots of bronze weapons in Indo-European graves along their initial invasion routes into Europe, this trend doesn't sustain in every theater they would come to operate in throughout the rest of Europe. So, in other words, it's far from a hard and fast rule, like in a video game where you instantly upgrade all your units to bronze, that kind of thing. And plus, even when these groups had a lot of bronze weapons, copper and stone weapons still remained as part of the toolkit. So this was more of a work with what you got kind of world. But for context here, the reason this is often mentioned with the Indo-Europeans, this bronze weapons thing, is because bronze weapons, in times and places where they had a lot of them, would have given them a big advantage over the European farmers. Because for those that don't know, bronze is a very hard metal, meaning that a sharpened blade will keep its cutting edge sharp even through repeated use, unlike pure copper, which is soft like gold and silver. Meaning that while you can 100% sharpen copper into a blade, which some European farmers groups did, the blade will blunt very quickly when fighting. And plus, copper rusts and it corrodes very quickly, and this is why most weapons we find among European farmers were made from stone, like stone axes and stone clubs, as well as flint knives and flint-tipped spears. And while this might sound low-tech, keep in mind that flint can be made sharper than even modern surgical instruments. The only problem, though, is that, like copper, flint loses its edge super quickly as the sharpened part of the rock chips off during combat. The point to all this being that when you're fighting over a prolonged period of time, bronze weapons were good and reliable. They were like the Toyotas of ancient warfare. And if you're into this topic, archaeologists have found a fully preserved, intact copper axe from this time period. Because, luckily for us, one of these Indo-European farmers took an arrow into his shoulder artery, and before bleeding out, he did all of us a favor by crawling into a deep, icy crevice up in the Alps, where he froze and he stayed frozen until he was discovered by 2 German hikers in 1991. Archaeologists call him Otzi the Iceman, and he died 5,200 years ago, around 3200 BC, likely just before the Yamnaya's expansion began. And the weapons and clothing he had on him provide an incredible snapshot of the European farmer. First, he was short. He was just 5'3", and when he died, he was carrying an axe with a 2-foot-long shaft and a small copper blade at the end. If you have a chance to look it up, most people, when they look at this, would consider this to be something like a pickaxe or a large hatchet, given how used we are to the large, heavy axe heads of the medieval period. And when he died, he was also carrying a 6-foot longbow with him, with flint-tipped arrowheads, as well as a 5-inch flint dagger. And this is why I describe bronze as a yes but no kind of advantage, Because you can have all the bronze tipped spears that you want, but you're still going to have a real bad day if you take an ultra sharp flint arrow to the chest. And to complete the picture here, Otzi's clothing was made from goatskin and sheepskin, including his shoes, but interestingly, the soles of his shoes were made from bearskin. Kind of interesting, isn't it? 5,000-year-old shoe design. And when he died, he was also wearing a cloak made from woven grass. And I love this story because it provides such an incredible snapshot, not only of the European farmers' weapon toolkit, but also the clothes that they wore as they fought these expanding Indo-European groups. Other possible answers that have been thrown around for advantages the Indo-Europeans had on the European farmers include things like disease, as there's some evidence that bubonic plague may have emerged out of the steppe during this time and worked its way through these European farming societies. The theory being here that because the virus likely came out of the steppe where the Yamnaya came from, that they may have been slightly more resistant to it. And if this were the case, it would have been a huge deal because it would have severely weakened a Europe that, even though it was still largely in the Stone Age, was more densely populated than the Pontic steppe. But to me, bubonic plague goes into the same bucket as bronze weapons because these Indo-European conquests of Europe occurred over a period of 800 years, with follow-on expansions across Eurasia and then down into India and even into Nepal later on, stretching the expansion timeline out to 2,500 years. So these conquests quite literally began half a millennia before the pyramids were built and continued on for thousands of years afterward. And I mention this because we know, for example, that it only took about 150 years for Europe's population to recover from the Black Death variant of the bubonic plague during the Middle Ages. And so to me, again, emphasis there, while plague may have been hugely influential in certain places at certain times, it doesn't seem like the factor that kept these conquests going and going and going. And I've uploaded a map of these conquests and their timelines for the curious, by the way. See image 4. The leading theory right now for what kept this party going on for so long, the most important of these people's Age of Empires faction perks, or the most important spice in the secret blend of 11 herbs and spices that made Alabama so great, was that these Indo-European groups were incredibly warlike and predatory. And academics believe they have identified a part of this cultural tradition in the form of something that occurs in the myths across the societies these Indo-European invasions will create. Something that also occurs in the Sanskrit texts that we spoke about at the beginning of this episode. And it's something that linguists believe may have been called something like the word Koryos. And across the Indo-European diaspora, words like this translate into things like army, and war band, and troop, and raiding party. David Anthony talks about how Koryos were groups of warriors probably made up of unmarried, non-inheriting sons, basically young men who aren't going to inherit property, that would leave their home communities to raid foreign tribes and thereby function as a kind of societal pressure release valve, where the problem that large numbers of surplus young men without strong prospects pose was exported on communities abroad. But there are also theories that it may have been a more universal rite of passage for boys entering manhood as well, and it may have been something in between these two things. Again, we're talking about something 5,000 years ago that we can only detect the ultra-faint echoes of in the myths that whisper to us across this massive gap of time. And the reason this is the most important element in this group's Age of Empires like faction perks, the most important of the secret 11 herbs and spices that made Alabama so great, was because by being a cultural practice, this is something that would have remained as part of this group's behavior even as they expanded further and further out of the steppe and into the deep, dark forests of northern Europe and Scandinavia, where, while they still might have been able to raise lots of horses and sheep, they weren't out in the Pontic steppe grassland anymore, right? And so a cultural practice like this, of being incredibly warlike, is a common thread that would have helped keep this party going regardless of how far out of the steppe these people got, or whether they could obtain bronze weaponry or not. According to David Anthony and others, choreos were heavily associated with wolves, that young men initiating into a choreo were seen as taking on aspects of the wolf, of transforming part of oneself into a wolf. And this wolf symbolism with warriorhood is found all over the Indo-European diaspora. For example, in both ancient Irish and Greek history, warriorhood and fighting rage are frequently associated with wolves. And fans of the Viking Age, which is probably all of you if you're listening to this, will know that wolf symbolism is all over the berserker phenomenon, which is something we'll talk a lot more about very soon. And fans of the Romans will remember that the legendary founders of Rome, named Romulus and Remus, were, and this is key, banished by their tribe and then raised by a she-wolf, and that these first Romans were just men, remember? And because they didn't have wives, they had to kidnap women from a neighboring tribe in order to start their city. Starting to ring any bells here? According to Cicero, Rome's oldest tradition was called the Lupercalia, luper meaning wolf. And during this festival, the blood of a sacrificed wolf was smeared on the forehead of young men, who would then run wild and naked around the city streets. Folks, just like the languages do, legends and traditions drift. They change over time, but they always retain a faint echo of their ancient shared roots. And for a long time, the choreo was more of a hypothesis until David Anthony, the archaeologist we've heard from a few times here, hit the literal jackpot by finding a choreo ritual initiation site in the Yamnaya homeland on the Pontic Steppe. And it really can't be overstated how incredibly lucky he got, because remember, not only is the Pontic Steppe a huge grassland, but the Yamnaya that David Anthony was studying were pastoral nomads who moved around as a way of life. So this is the literal equivalent of finding like a needle in a haystack. When David Anthony found the site in question, it immediately stood out to him because he found dog bones, specifically 18 dog skeletons and nothing else. And this stood out because the Yamnaya ate everything, even horses, but the dog always got spared the butcher's knife. And we know this because dogs are almost never found with signs of butchery. But at this site, the dog skeletons show signs of having been ritually killed, as their heads have been carefully chopped into 10 to 12 small, almost identical segments with an axe. And the marks on the skeleton show that they have been cooked and eaten, all things that point to this being a ceremony or ritual. Folks, any group with a societal tradition of initiating their surplus young men into wolf-themed groups of monsters for export abroad are either going to burn out super fast or produce a predatory, expeditionary culture. Because just imagine what one of these tribes' cultures is like when the founders were all warriors from one of these choreos who took over an area, who raised their kids with stories of fighting, of how they did it when they were young, where kids are raised on stories of living off the land and of surprise attacks on villages, of ambushes and battles and everything in between. In my mind's eye, I picture a boy bouncing on his father's knee as the man points out areas in the distance where a battle or ambush took place. Let me tell you where I got the scar, that kind of thing. Because just imagine what it's like to be a boy growing up in this world, where all the men that you know have scars and other major injuries, as well as the mental wounds from battle. Because if you grew up in a society like this, you would have been raised to consider fighting a normal part of adulthood. It was just what you did. And keep in mind, because these conquests occurred across millennia, dozens and dozens and dozens of generations would have lived like this, gradually distilling these people into an extraordinarily militarized culture. In the stories that manage to filter down to us in myths and legends like a little quiet whisper across the 5,000 years that separates us from them, we see lords with groups of oath-bound retainers, with an elite culture focused on great feasts and drinking mead, which for those that don't know is a wine made from honey, and the public recitation of heroic poetry. And I love how Norwegian archaeologist Dagfinn Scree, who I'm a massive fan of, speaks to this in his absolutely incredible book on an unrelated subject called The Northern Routes to Kingship. He writes, I quote, "It appears that among Indo-Europeans, the idea was developed that the only route to transgressing the profound human condition of being subject to death was to conduct heroic deeds and thus achieve immortality through fame and renown, which was conveyed into eternity in poems and tales. The fact that this idea was perpetuated through several millennia and penetrated religion, poetry, tales, and social life within cultures as diverse as the Germanic, Greek, Persian, and Indian is a testament to its compelling and forceful response to the pan-human conundrum, meaning death." End quote. So great feasts, the drinking of mead, and the public recitation of poems that speak to heroic deeds of warriors long past, may be dead, but now seemingly immortal to those listening. Things that will all be a huge part of the Viking Age we'll later get into. Can you imagine being a kid and being raised with these kinds of stories and expectations to live up to? You know, these days we aspire for our young ones to go out to Silicon Valley and hustle and grind in a startup or help Facebook find new ways to get people to click on ads. But for these Indo-European kids 5,000 years ago, their path to being winners and living the good life was through war. It reminds me of that famous Conan the Barbarian quote when he is asked, "Conan, what is the greatest in life?" And he replies, "To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentations of their women." And while it might seem ridiculous to quote Conan the Barbarian, it does feel like that is quite literally what we're looking at here. And this warlike culture was arguably the Indo-European group's biggest Age of Empires faction perk, because while having good technology like bronze always matters, simply having a male population who is tough and willing to fight is a critical enabler of military power. For example, when I was an intelligence analyst in Washington, D.C., one of the more popular topics of discussion was Taiwan, because Taiwan has always been the potential flashpoint of our age between the US and China. In many of these, unclassified, discussions I had with colleagues and friends would often boil down to whether Taiwanese civilian men would fight in an invasion scenario. Because while Taiwan has a small professional army, it also has over 1 million reservists, which is a lot of meat to throw at any airfield or port that the Chinese manage to take, which they would need to hold in order to resupply from the mainland. Because, context/fun fact here, but Taiwan is blessed by coasts that have long mudflats, and so resupply by the Chinese couldn't just be done by, dropping things off on a beach in most cases. And so the question of how many civilian men are going to fight while getting rained on by the Chinese Air Force and maybe starving is a big question, if not the question. And it's a question that has everything to do with how motivated they are, or how motivated they could be under various hypothetical circumstances. In all respect to Taiwan, but one thing that a friend of mine who lived there would always remind me of was that Taiwan youth don't have and aren't cultivated to have a martial culture or ethos or tradition that would encourage this kind of behavior that you would need to throw a PLA brigade back into the ocean. In all respect to Taiwan, but if modern Taiwan male youth, apologies folks for taking everyone on this wild tangent, but if modern Taiwan male youth are on one side of this martial spectrum, these 5,000-year-old Indo-Europeans are on the other side of it. Is peace even possible if you have neighboring tribes like this? And this might partially be why the Indo-European expansion continued uncoordinated for millennia across much of Eurasia. Because if a people have societal expectations and traditions like this, well, they are going to keep organically pushing and pushing until they hit something capable of resisting them, right? And David Anthony makes the point that even if a Koryo was resisted and it didn't seize territory, they would still be returning to their home tribe as fully matured warriors with good intel. Like where the good pasture for grazing horses is, and where there are societal divisions or weak defenses. All things that would give the Indo-European tribes a lot better odds when round two eventually occurs. And so to be neighbors with these people could have been like a slow but perpetual knife fight. And personal speculation here, but I wonder how often leaders in large Indo-European tribal zones got together and coordinated these war parties. Hey, instead of raiding each other, why don't we all team up against those other people who aren't like us way over there? It'd be far from the last or the first time in history when people achieve peace by collectively redirecting their violent tendencies towards others abroad. And if this were the case, again, personal speculation here, grains of salt, then Indo European tribal zones would sort of function like army factories, systematically belching out these predatory expeditionary groups abroad. But regardless of how this all functioned, what this means is that fighting occurred throughout the entirety of Europe. So next time you look at a map of the region, try and picture in your mind thousands of little symbols on the map denoting where different types of fighting took place. From small battles and skirmishes, raids, patrols, and ambushes, the equivalent of what a siege would be of a small village, heroic last stands, desperate flights and aggressive pursuits, all occurring throughout every landscape that Europe has to offer. Because, folks, this is a story of conquest and subjugation that saw the destruction and replacement of the majority of the people living there. And one of the interesting things about this expansion was its speed, because this wasn't some incremental, just a few miles a year sort of thing. And we know this because David Anthony found four individuals across a 2,700-mile range whose genes show a common ancestor 4 to 5 generations before them. For example, two of these men died in Hungary and Moldova, in Eastern Europe, and the third died in the Yamnaya homeland on the Pontic Steppe, while the fourth met his end way out in Western Mongolia. Folks, this is like the same distance as the width of the continental United States, like between San Francisco and Boston. And so for my American listeners, you have to think about a people emerging from a place like Kansas City or Omaha, and then within 4 to 5 generations, spreading out across the entire continental US. That's how fast they were moving. And another interesting way we can approximate their expansion speed is by analyzing the elements in their teeth, because the fact that we form our adult teeth early in life means that the elements used to create them reflect the things we ate and the water we drank where we grew up. And because water and soil isn't the same everywhere, in the sense that there are tiny chemical differences that archaeologists can detect, which they can then overlay onto maps that scientists have created based on their knowledge of soil and water makeup today, that your adult teeth can kind of point to where you grew up. And this teeth analysis shows that the Yamnaya sometimes died hundreds of miles away from where they grew up as children. And so when you picture these corios, you have to contextualize them within the highly mobile context that comes with pastoral nomads who, remember, had a lot of horses. Because these are people that had an entirely new relationship with distances. And the sheer extent of their expansion is part of what makes the story so interesting. Because isn't it strange to conceptualize a world where, for a long time, there were closely related languages linking Northern Europe, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and even the South Asian world, stretching as far east as the area of Xinjiang in modern-day Western China, and Nepal and the Indian subcontinent? It kind of turns history on its head, doesn't it? Because we are talking about a world where, for a time, it was likely possible for someone to travel from Scotland or Scandinavia down past the Alps, through the Balkans, into Greece, then make the crossing into modern-day Turkey, then walk across northern Iraq, Iran, into Pakistan, and walk right into India, and have been able to engage in at least some basic limited dialogue with people the entire time. And if this still seems like a stretch to you, I don't blame you, but consider, good sir, how similar Sanskrit is even to modern-day Lithuanian, languages that are separated by 2,500 years and over 3,000 miles as the crow flies. And, again, apologies if I'm butchering any pronunciations here, but in modern-day Lithuanian, the word for gods is divas, while in ancient Sanskrit, the word is devas. Then in modern Lithuanian, the word for fire is ugnis, while in ancient Sanskrit, it is agnes. In modern Lithuanian, teeth are called dentis, while in ancient Sanskrit, they are called dentas. So, although our hypothetical traveler would rely on a good deal of hand gesturing and slow talking, because languages are drifting, right? Linguists believe that it takes about 300 to 400 years for languages to drift into a new language. We are still looking at a world where basic communication may have been possible across a huge geography for a very long time. In my mind, this may have been like someone with a deep, thick New Orleans Cajun accent trying to have a conversation with someone from like the Scottish Highlands or something. And if you're not an American or simply don't know anyone like this, I've uploaded a video labeled Image 5 of Louisiana State University's former football coach named Ed Orgeron, whose deep Cajun accent is like the perfect example of what I'm talking about here. And for those who listened to it or looked him up, remember that he is still absolutely speaking English, just like a super accented Scotsman from the Highlands is also technically speaking English, each just with extraordinarily different enunciations and culture-specific words. Another reason I absolutely love this story is because it makes everything about Eurasia's pre-Christian and Muslim pagan belief systems suddenly click into place. Because kind of like how the languages drifted, so too did the Yamnaya's original belief system as their descendant groups expanded further and further out, conquering and mixing with different subjugated peoples all along the way. Something that over time would slowly change the original Yamnaya gods, while also changing their belief system's worldview, their concept of what the universe was, but all while still retaining a faint echo of their shared ancient roots, even when separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles. Now, like I said, I love this topic. So before we get into this, please keep in mind that this is a key terms and names heavy episode, so no need to put any of these specifics to memory. But with that said, consider, for example, the similarities that sky and thunder gods share across the Indo-European world. First, there is Thor, the Norse sky and thunder god, who wields a hammer and lightning as weapons, will fight a giant serpent during the climactic battle with the forces of chaos at the end of the world, called Ragnarok. So remember, lightning weapons and fighting a giant serpent. Those are the key things here. Now pivot your gaze to the Baltic, whose Indo-European people's thunder god Perkunaz, if I'm pronouncing that right, also carries a hammer and uses lightning as a weapon, and also fights a devil-like god from their underworld. And then we have the Slavic god named Perun, who also uses lightning as a weapon and who also battles an evil serpent and dragon-like creature. Then there's the most famous Indo-European thunder god of all, the Greek sky and thunder god Zeus, who wields a lightning bolt weapon and fights and kills a giant serpent to secure his dominance over the cosmos. Moving further southeast across Eurasia here, we encounter the Hittites, an Indo-European people who lived in the region of modern-day Turkey, whose weather god, named Tarhunt, wielded lightning as a weapon and also, what do you know, fought a dragon. And then there are the Sanskrit-speaking peoples in India with their Vedic religion, whose storm god, named Indra, also wields a lightning weapon and also slays a dragon serpent. Now, all of these gods also have their own unique backstories and other things they're associated with, as well as different levels of importance within their respective pantheons. But if you were a sky/weather/storm god for an Indo-European people, well, chances are you're going to have a lightning weapon and have to fight a dragon, serpent, or some devil-like creature. And if you say to yourself, Henry, obviously everyone's sky god is going to have a lightning weapon, and most gods fight monsters. True, but then there are smaller details that stayed constant. Like the fact that many of the Indo-European sky gods in Europe, like Thor and Zeus, in Rome's Jupiter, and the Celtic sky god Tyrannus, were all associated with oak trees. Again, faint echoes of shared roots thousands of years old. Now, obviously, these gods drifted away from one another. For instance, Rome's sky god Jupiter doesn't fight a dragon. So these aren't hard and fast rules in the sense that, this drift process isn't formulaic. It doesn't have a set procedure. Rather, it was random. And like we talked about, it likely had a lot to do with the different peoples these Indo European invasion groups were subjugating during their journeys. For example, in Europe, if you recall, we spoke of several groupings of Indo European peoples that archaeologists call the corded ware in the southeastern Yamnaya, and then the Bell Beaker culture, and how the corded ware entered Europe through Belarus and Poland before arriving in northern Germany, while the southeastern Yamnaya entered via Bulgaria and likely followed the Danube westward into the Balkans, with the rest of Western Europe, France, Spain, northern Italy, and the British Isles being later taken over by the Indo-European Bell Beaker culture. Routes that saw these Yamnaya descendant peoples separated for long periods of time and huge distances, all while they each ruled over different subjugated peoples who themselves had different belief systems. In my mind, I envision this process like how a very old family recipe for chili that someone's great great grandma created changes from generation to generation, where as various family members move away to new places, the recipe begins to change. Maybe not intentionally, maybe because when someone moved, they picked up a new idea for a new ingredient. Or maybe someone moved and they married a local woman who raised the kids and added her own ingredient to the family's legendary chili recipe that her husband taught her. And so, as time goes on and this family spreads further and further out, well, you begin to get all kinds of variations of great great grandma's original chili recipe, right? And it's this drift process that I'm trying to describe here that makes the Norse belief system that we're going to get into later on during this podcast series so genuinely alien and fascinating. Because of the peoples these Indo European invasion groups will eventually transform into, like the Greeks and the Latins and the Celts and the Hittites, and so on and so forth, we're adding things like habaneros and beans and spinach to Grandma's original chili recipe. The Scandinavians are adding psychedelic mushrooms to it. Because the offshoot of the corded ware that entered Scandinavia, if you recall, called the battle axe culture, would be conquering and subjugating peoples whose belief systems were shamanistic. And while we'll get into what this entails in the future, this shamanism found in Eurasia's polar regions, which include Scandinavia, had beliefs like spirits that inhabited everything from the land and the trees and animals, as well as strange concepts of the soul and a concept of the universe where multiple worlds existed, that Earth wasn't the only world, and that individuals skilled in magic could move between these worlds. But even with all this drift, there were still enough similarities that both the Romans and the Greeks had a practice of interpreting other people's gods as versions of their own. It's called the Interpretatio Romano and the Interpretatio Graeca, meaning the Roman and Greek interpretation. And this was a thing because you bump into enough people and realize that both your sky gods tend to have lightning weapons, or slay dragons or serpents, or like oak trees, and you're going to realize real quick you're worshiping similar guys. And some of these similarities didn't require much analytical interpretation. Like, consider the similarities between the Norse, Greek, and other Indo European peoples' belief systems about the afterlife. For example, in the Norse belief system, one of their realms for the dead is called Hell. And for context, yes, that's where the word came from. For your entire life, you've been unknowingly using a Germanic loanword that the priests who converted the Germanic peoples to Christianity originally appropriated to make that conversion process smoother. And the key thing here is that the Norse hell was deep underground. And to get there, one had to cross a bridge over a river churning with knives and swords, and once across, hell itself is enclosed by a wall with a single gate that is guarded by a massive dog named Garm. And so, take a step back and consider what you're looking at. Hell is underground. You have to cross a bridge to get there, and it's enclosed by a wall with a single gate that is guarded by a great dog, okay? Now consider the similarity to the Greek pagan tradition. As recorded in the Iliad, the Greek realm of the dead, called Hades, is also deep underground, and to get there, one also has to cross the river Styx by boat. And once across, the entrance to Hades is guarded by a multi-headed dog named Cerberus. And then you have the Albanian pagans, who also believed a three-headed dog guarded their realm of the dead. And then in Celtic mythology, their underworld is also guarded by a dog who guides souls on the journey to the afterlife. And apparently, the Indo-Europeans who moved into Iran weren't satisfied with the security that one dog could provide, so in the Zoroastrian tradition in Persia, the bridge that links the realms of the living and the dead is guarded by two dogs, each with four eyes. And then in India, within the precursor to Hinduism known as the Vedic religion, to get to their realm of the dead, one also had to cross a river, and the ruler of that realm is said to own two dogs, also each with four eyes, who guard souls on their journey to the afterlife. Isn't it wild how similarities like this were maintained across thousands of years and thousands of miles of separation? Because there was no centralized church enforcing this dogma, where you had little Indo-European inquisitors ranging from Ireland to India to make sure that everyone's sky god fought a dragon and liked oak trees while clamping down on any non-canine guardians of the afterlife. Rather, these beliefs remain similar because these people consistently taught their little ones, generation after generation, about who the gods were and what they were like, and what the universe was made of, and also basic things like whether people had a destiny or fate. Which brings us to one of these instances where these belief systems remained extremely similar. This is one of my favorite examples because it's so unusual, and it's the similarity between the Norse and the Greek pagan belief in and conceptualization of fate. For example, in the Norse concept of the universe, everyone was born with a predetermined fate that was given to them at birth by beings called Norns. There were three of these Norns, probably named past, present, and future, and they were among the most powerful entities in the Norse universe because they handed down each person's fate to them at birth by weaving it on a loom, which is a device used for making cloth, with the destiny of each person foretold in the pattern that they wove. In other words, one's pattern in this cloth determined what happened and what is happening and what will happen in one's life. So to the Norse, the threads in this celestial cloth were your destiny. The Norns could cut it short and in your life if they wanted to, or they could weave prosperity or sickness, health, love, disaster, anything. In other words, fate was a core, fundamental part of the Norse understanding of how the universe worked. And 1,200 miles to the south, virtually a world away, are the Greeks, who also believed in fate. In their worldview, there were mythical entities called fates, which is where the word comes from, as luck would have it, or perhaps as fate would have it, right? And these fates also wove each person's destiny into a cloth on a sacred loom, whose threads also foretold how one's life would turn out. And for you fans of Greek history, the concept of fate is all over the Iliad and is quite literally one of the defining themes, if not the defining theme of the story. And of all the quotes about fate in the book, there's one I want to read in particular, because it adds so much color to this and humanizes what would otherwise just be a concept we marvel at from afar. And in this scene, the Trojan prince Hector is speaking to his nervous wife in Troy before returning to the field to renew his fight with the Greeks. I'm quoting from the Robert Fagel's translation, by the way, which is incredible. I quote, Hector stroked her gently, trying to reassure her, repeating her name. Andromache, Andromache, dear one, why so desperate? Why so much grief for me? No man will hurl me down to Hades against my fate. And fate, no one alive has ever escaped it, neither brave man nor coward, I tell you. It's born with us the day that we are born. End quote. Imagine having a worldview like that, with all the implications of what believing in fate carries with it. Now, what is surprising about all this is how little attention is given to it. Because remember, for Western Civ, this is it. This is where it began. The languages, the peoples, their cultures, their pre Christian religions, all of it has its roots in this migration event. Think about all the clash of civilization conflicts that military history nerds love, like the Greeks and the Persian Wars, or Alexander's conquest of Persia, or the Roman wars with the Gauls and Britons and Germans. These were all between people that had one point in their past been a lot more similar. And then you have things like Hinduism, which has Indo-European roots, or the fact that the Buddha was born to an Indo-European speaking people in Nepal. So one would think that there'd be enough little asterisks and notes in all the history content one learns through one's life that the story would be common knowledge. But it's not. And the more that I read into this topic, the more that I began to understand why. And the answer lies in the fact that the story makes the archaeological community, in the broader academic world, and a whole lot of other people very uncomfortable because of the story's association with Nazi ideology during World War II. And you might ask yourself, what does this several thousand-year-old story have to do with Nazi ideology? Well, it has a lot to do with the timing of Sir William Jones' discovery of the language. And the best way to think about this is kind of like how a forest fire starts, where when certain things happen in the right order at the right time, like high winds blowing over a forest that people haven't let burn in a few years, meaning that there's a ton of flammable material stacked up in the undergrowth, combined with a period of dry weather to create a situation where it only takes a little spark to start a massive forest fire like the one that devastated Los Angeles in 2025. And I like this analogy because any of those things on their own, like high wind or letting the brush stack up, aren't particularly dangerous. But if everything happens in just the right order at the right time, well, then something seemingly small, like the story of a 5,000-year-old mega conquest, can have a huge, outsized influence on things. Because just as Indo European was becoming a hot topic in Europe in the mid to late 1800s, three things happened that formed the recipe for our ideological forest fire. First, another Englishman discovered something abroad. This time it was Charles Darwin, who came back from his famous trip to the Galapagos and published his theories on natural selection and evolution in his book On the Origin of Species in 1859. A book that posited that the key mechanism by which evolution takes place was through competition, where species that have an edge win and expand, survival of the fittest and all of that. And folks, this became a lens through which Europeans began to view and understand the world. And they liked this lens. Because remember, at this time in the late 1800s, Europeans were nearing the height of their imperial power, ruling over almost all of Africa, the entirety of the Indian subcontinent, from modern-day Pakistan to Bangladesh, almost all of Southeast Asia, as well as the Central Asian steppe. So you can imagine how this Darwinian worldview made them feel. Why do we get to rule the world? Well, because we're superior, of course. But what happens when countries begin to see themselves in distinct racial terms? And this brings us to the second element in our ideological forest fire, nationalism, which began to arise in the 1800s in Europe that saw people beginning to identify more as being part of a nation rather than part of their locality or part of their region. And people began to invent racial terms to distinguish countries from one another, categorizing them into groups like, I kid you not, the Mediterranean race, and the Alpine race, and the Nordic race, among others. And in this hyper-competitive European political environment, full of nationalist sentiments, these countries began to view each other with the same Darwinian lens that they were viewing the rest of the world, basically sizing each other up while conceptualizing things like national power and racial survival of the fittest terms. So in our forest fire analogy, this is like the wind picking up and blowing towards LA. The weather has been unusually hot and dry for a few weeks. People are a bit anxious, but it's not a crisis yet. But then enter from stage left is our third element, something we'll call maybe forest mismanagement, which is the creation of the first centralized German state. And the creation of the first truly centralized German political entity is part of our forest fire, not because the Germans don't deserve their own country, obviously, but because when Germany was created, all the cool kids in Europe were developing nationalist narratives by which to define themselves, all of which had storied histories stretching back into the fog of time. Well, the new German state not only wanted to do what the cool kids were doing as well, but they really needed to do it because they needed a uniquely German national story to serve as glue to hold the many duchies and principalities that had formerly been independent, in practical terms, for centuries together. And in our analogy here, this endeavor to create a story is a major part of our forest fire analogy because, what to choose? What to choose for the national origin story of the German people? You can see where this is going. So take a step back and consider what we have here. We have hyper-competitive European geopolitics, all viewing each other in racial terms, with the Darwinian survival of the fittest worldview and the German need for a strong national story to glue together their newly created state. And while all these things on their own are potentially combustible, we still don't have a spark, do we? But in 1902, one appeared. And the person who made that spark has a name. And his name was Gustav Cassina. Now, for context here, Gustav Cassina was a German archaeologist, and he was an archaeologist at a time when the field of archaeology was in its infancy. And this matters for our story because Cassina was kind of a pioneer in many respects. He was doing the archaeological work, but he was also kind of figuring out as he went. And his focus was exploring the Indo-European topic. And in 1902, he published research claiming that northern Germany and southern Scandinavia was the Indo-European homeland, that the Indo-European language's roots were, therefore, Germanic, and that this ancient conquest had been done by Scandinavians and Germans, and that these people's ancestors were, therefore, most concentrated in Scandinavia. Now, at the start of this episode, I mentioned how, initially, Proto-Indo-European was inconvenient for these nationalist movements because it robbed them of a chance to create a unique story for their nation. Because if everyone in Europe is ultimately Indo-European, well, that rains on the parade of your unique special story for your nationalism, doesn't it? But if you're the Germans and you're the new country in the bloc that's having some trouble coming up with a nice national narrative to glue everyone together, while claiming the title of homeland of the Indo-Europeans is a nice, unifying and pride-inducing thing that everyone can get behind, right? In an age of hyper-competitive European politics where everyone is interpreting the world through Darwin's survival of the fittest lens, being the homeland of the Indo-European mega-conquerors has a nice ring to it. Because you can point to your ancestors and say, we are superior because nature selected our ancestors to conquer much of Eurasia. Thank you very much. I love how archaeologist David Anthony describes this. It's so poetic in its brevity. He calls this a self-congratulatory ideology. And don't make the mistake of thinking this was just some small meaningless thing put into a government folder and stashed away, or something debated by academics in the ivory tower. This stuff was purposely baked into the educational programs of the state and taught in schools so that it could transform into a self-reproducing cultural belief. But the problem was that Cassina had made one huge mistake. When he saw Indo-European cultures around Germany, whose stuff looked pretty similar to the Indo-European corded ware that had existed in Germany, he assumed that this meant an expansion outward, when in reality, the corded ware were almost certainly just one stepping stone in a very long line of stepping stones. But without having access to DNA analysis or precise dating techniques, Cassina had simply looked at one stone in this long line and assumed that that was the beginning. And the reason this topic makes everyone uncomfortable is because Everything we are describing here was like a thunderbolt injecting raw energy into an ideology of racial supremacy. And this ideology of racial supremacy influenced Nazi policies and behavior. Now, I want to be careful here. All kinds of things led to the rise of Nazism, but this belief in racial supremacy was a central pillar of Nazi ideology that led to all kinds of policies, like the Nazi policy of Lebensraum that many of you will be familiar with. And for those that don't know, this is where the Nazis sought to eject peoples from Eastern Europe they deemed as subhuman for replacement by themselves, the self described Aryans, in order to create living space, literally like farmland, for the Aryan peoples to expand. And they did this because they saw themselves as protectors of the Aryan heritage, and thus were acting in accordance with the Darwinian laws of nature and doing their duty to their people under the survival of the fittest moral framework of social Darwinism. You can see how all this is coming together, right? And beyond this, while the German push eastward against Poland and then the Soviets happened for all kinds of reasons, the Germans justified it by claiming Eastern Europe and Western Russia as their birthright by virtue of being descendant of the Indo-European corded ware culture, which, after arriving in northern Germany, later did conquer back eastward and live in these regions. Folks, this is why this topic is so uncomfortable for the academic community and many others, because archaeologists, more than anyone, are aware how someone from their own discipline made a mistaken interpretation and inadvertently contributed to this ideological forest fire. Because while you and I might look at the Nazi flag and see a swastika, archaeologists see an Indo-European symbol for the sun and for good luck. And it reminds them of the role their discipline played in this event, because in the archaeological community's eyes, Cosina stuck a shovel in the ground, but instead of digging up insights and knowledge, he dug up Pandora's box. And because he was an archaeologist and people listened to him because, he was the guy to listen to on this topic, he could proverbially open Pandora's box. In the archaeological community's view, Cosina stuck a shovel in the ground, and a few decades later, German armies were following the path of their corded ware descendants, infused with an iron determination that comes from the calling to defend what they considered to be the master race. And all of this is why research into this topic almost entirely stopped after the war ended. And it's why you probably haven't heard this story. Because after the war ended, academic interpretation of the language's expansion overreacted and swung like a pendulum into the extreme opposite direction, where instead of a conquest, subjugation, and replacement migration model that Cosina and others had put forth, which had now only recently come back in vogue, the post-war thesis was one where the language had spread peacefully through trade contacts. That maybe there was a tiny bit of people movement, but no major migration had taken place. So it was all very kumbaya, that somehow this Indo-European language had become such a fad that everyone from Ireland to India adopted it, along with its religion and large parts of its culture. And this was the consensus belief until recently, because until recently, archaeologists who even so much as whispered the migration word were immediately attacked by their colleagues, because even so much as whispering the M word was seen as being a Nazi and trying to dig up Pandora's box again. And this overreaction spread throughout the historical field like a cancer, way beyond the Indo-European topic, where even topics far removed from this, like the fall of the Western Roman Empire, were suddenly reevaluated, with migration stripped from the historical narrative. And don't believe me, listen to Peter Heather, the author of an incredible book on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire called Empire and Barbarians, where, because he knew this topic was so sensitive, he dedicated an entire section at the beginning of his book just to justify using migration as part of his narrative for the fall of the Western Roman Empire. In his book, he talks about how after the 1960s, I quote, "Migration became the great Satan of archaeological explanation." And it wasn't until recently that brave academics supported with our newfound ability to test DNA, have begun to push back on this. And keep in mind, this pressure to not say the M word was strong as recently as 2015. For example, listen to this story from Harvard Medical School genetics professor David Reich, who, by the way, is the pioneering geneticist of our time on this topic and is also of Jewish and German descent. I'm quoting from his incredible book called Who We Are and How We Got Here, which, if you're into this topic, you should 100% buy and read. I quote, "Discussions of the corded ware culture and migration in the same breath ring particularly loud alarm bells because of Cosina and the Nazis' attempts to use the corded ware culture to construct a basis for national German identity. While we were in the final stages for preparing a paper for submission in 2015, one of the German archaeologists who contributed skeletal samples wrote a letter to all co-authors that said, 'We must avoid being compared with the methods of Gustav Cassina.' Then he and several contributors then resigned as authors before we modified our papers to highlight differences between Cassina's thesis and our findings." End quote. Folks, a German archaeologist in 2015 was so haunted by the ghost of Gustav Cassina that instead of looking at the data and judging it on its merits, he instead processed an archaeological paper written by the leading archaeogeneticist of our time, who was also of German and Jewish descent, through a political correctness filter. The guy literally saw the M word, panicked, and not only withdrew his involvement from the study, but then tried to sabotage it by encouraging others to withdraw as well. Now, fortunately, the world has made a lot of progress since 2015, as enough academics with a spine push back on the invertebrates, hence why this episode is clearly telling a conquest, subjugation, and migration story. Now, to be clear, the Nazis were wrong about all kinds of things. For example, the language's homeland is not in Germany, and Hitler would probably die of shock if he knew that the probable Aryan homeland was in southern Ukraine, a place he considered to be inhabited by subhumans. And they were also wrong in their belief that the language's spread was done by a pure Aryan people, as the Yamnaya absolutely mixed with the conquered and subjugated locals as they expanded. But with that said, genetic testing done by Reich and others has made it clear that the spread of this language was done by conquest and migration. And that while these people did mix with the locals, these invasions, especially the early ones into Europe, were almost entirely Yamnaya on a genetic level. And while Cassina was also likely wrong in asserting a Northern European origin for the language, Scandinavia strangely does have the highest concentration of this Yamnaya DNA, specifically Norway, and this is followed closely by almost all of Northern Europe and the Baltic region. It's an uncomfortable topic to talk about, isn't it? But that's kind of how genetically testing our past is, because there is no hiding from the story that the DNA we carry within us can tell. And this genetic testing on remains before and after the Indo-Europeans showed up paints a brutal picture of how all of this went down. And this is why I started this episode by saying that, even as a history nerd, I'm not sure I could watch this expansion event on video if given the chance. You know, the aliens come down tomorrow on the White House lawn and tell us they've recorded our entire history and it'll be on Netflix tomorrow. I don't think I turn it on. Because the DNA evidence that Reich's lab found suggests that these invasions replaced 70% of Central Europe's population and 90% of the British Isles, and somewhere between 30% of the people living in the Spanish Peninsula. So while not everyone got the extermination and genocide treatment, even estimates like 30% speak of an overwhelmingly brutal subjugation event. What is particularly dark about this story is that we can get a sense of how it happened by tracking which parts of the DNA changed, because we now have the ability to track both paternal and maternal ancestry. On the paternal side, this is done by looking at a piece of the Y chromosome that is inherited by boys exclusively from their fathers. And on the maternal side, this is done by looking at a part of our DNA called mitochondrial DNA that is only inherited by girls from their mothers. And because these parts of the DNA change extremely slowly, means that they largely stay consistent from generation to generation, meaning that we can not only track population movements, but we can also get a rough approximation of how violent a conflict was. Because we can look back in time and see these genetic markers suddenly disappear in an area and be replaced by markers from elsewhere. And the reason this tells a dark story is because it also tells us how these genocides went down. Because while we find European farmer mitochondrial DNA, from their women, and skeletons from before and after the invasion remaining present even in modern day populations, we find extremely little European farmer Y chromosomal DNA. And so the picture of what happened becomes relatively clear. Men were genocided en masse regardless of their age, and the surviving women mixed with the conquerors. We don't know what the arrangement was for this incorporation. We can track who survived, but DNA doesn't tell us about the manner of these women's assimilation. So it may have run the gamut from things like sexual slavery to things like forced concubinage, where women were forced into domestic household roles but very much doubled as sexual partners and raised children. It could have been things like voluntary concubinage, where women chose to enter into this arrangement because they could live a better life, all the way to whatever the Yamnaya might have considered full legal marriage, because we do know that the Yamnaya were polygynous, meaning that men could have multiple wives. But regardless of how this went down, the end result was the same: the genocide and replacement of the vast, vast majority of men and most of the women in Northern Europe. I saw some interesting speculation on Twitter that theorized that this selective killing of men may have contributed to how these people managed to spread so far so fast, because a conquering male population could sire a ton of children very quickly, maybe. Again, we don't know. And while none of this is a pleasant topic to discuss, it does show that the Nazi vision of these people as a sort of pure racial juggernaut couldn't be further from the truth. And there is irony in the fact that the Aryans that Sir William Jones and the Nazis read about in the Sanskrit texts, the people that conquered most of India, derived half their DNA from peoples they had conquered as they pushed through Afghanistan and Iran. And when they conquered India, they mixed with the locals even more. So it's a strange thing to think about, isn't it? The children of this extraordinarily violent process continuing the same predatory, genocidal conquests of their fathers and grandfathers stretching back generations. Because this male genocide pattern was repeated in most places these people subjugated, including India. Because when David Reich analyzed ancient Indian DNA in 2009, he found a similar pattern of male genocide as had happened in Northern Europe, with steppe DNA from these groups exclusively in the Y chromosome among many Indians, especially those in India's upper castes in northern India, like in Punjab, but none in the mitochondrial DNA. And when Reich shared these findings with his Indian counterparts, they freaked out. Because kind of like how this topic made some European nationalists uncomfortable in the 1800s because it eroded their unique national story, well, this story makes Hindu nationalists uncomfortable today. Because while ethnic nationalism has been destroyed in the West, it is alive and well in India. And so admitting that major elements of Indian language and religion have foreign roots that were introduced by an outside invader that killed off many of the men but procreated with the women is hugely subversive to this ethnic nationalism. Now, Reich doesn't say he was threatened, but I do wonder, because he calls this the most stressful 24 hours of his career. And he makes it clear in his book, in no uncertain terms, that his counterparts in India wanted him to bury the story. He eventually reached a compromise with them by getting creative with the name he gave to these invaders, changing their name from West Eurasians to Ancestral North Indians, a change that some might call constructive ambiguity. And again, while none of this would pass for polite conversation at a dinner party, deep down I think we can all understand the angle here, right? If we shed our modern sensibilities. Because just put yourself in the shoes of a boy raised in this incredibly predatory and warlike culture, and imagine you are the third or fourth son and don't stand to inherit your father's lands and cattle. Wouldn't you want to go out and conquer something and be top dog rather than scrape by for a living? Because remember, this is the equivalent of going out and staking your claim, like an American kid might go out to Silicon Valley and grind it out, just with less violence. So, this was the last major turnover in Europe's genetic base. Because, like we mentioned earlier, while people are always moving around regionally in various small ways, this was the last huge replacement migration event done to Europe by a people from outside the region. And this means that the vast majority of Northern Europeans today can trace most of their DNA to this migration event. And this has been measured because the same Y chromosomal and mitochondrial DNA trackers can be traced in modern populations. I've uploaded two maps that visualize this process, see images 6 and 7, which show a map of people in Northern Europe that have at least some Yamnaya ancestry. And for those that can't see, it's everyone. 100% of the population in Northern Europe has at least some DNA from these groups. And the second map shows an assessment of how much of each modern day European country's DNA comes from the Yamnaya. And for those that can't see it, Scandinavia and the Baltic states of modern day Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, as well as England and southern Scotland, all derive the majority of their DNA from this ancient migration event. And as we shift our gaze south into the regions of Spain, France, and central Germany, the Yamnaya genetic marker diminishes to about a third to a quarter of the population. And when we shift our gaze further south to southern Spain and southern Italy, the number drops to 10%, with this genetic marker being almost entirely absent from the Basque region of northern Spain, as well as from the Mediterranean islands of Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily, as well as Finland. All places that benefit from strong natural defenses like mountains and oceans. And while we are looking at a map that has been influenced by almost 5,000 years of people moving around in their various small ways, it is still indicative of where the Indo-European hammer fell the hardest. And if you're curious about specific country breakdowns, I've also uploaded a table, see image 8, that sorts countries by their percent Yamnaya DNA, which I pulled from a Nature publication by Wolfgang Hack and others. And for those that can't see, Scandinavia is the most Yamnaya of all regions worldwide, again with Norway having the strongest concentration of this genetic marker. Folks, this is the factor that drives regional differences in how various European peoples look today, because different European looks are in large part due to different mixtures of the steppe DNA combined with European farmer DNA and hunter-gatherer DNA. In quick context here, I know we haven't mentioned hunter-gatherers yet, but this refers to peoples that had dominated Europe until about 7000 BC, which is when these European farmer groups began to seize most of the continent, with hunter-gatherers hanging on, usually in close proximity to the European farmers, in places like Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. And the reason I mention this is because when different Indo-European groups invaded Europe along their disparate trajectories, they mixed with different groups of people along the way. With the corded ware offshoot mixing with a lot more hunter-gatherers, and the Yamnaya group that moved southeast along the Danube, and the Bell Beaker people that took France, Spain, northern Italy, and the British Isles, mixing with a lot more European farmers. And so, when you look at someone from Norway, you are generally looking at the result of a recipe that is about half Yamnaya and a quarter of both European farmer and hunter-gatherer. And when you look at someone from southern France, you are generally looking at someone who is about half European farmer, roughly 40-ish% Yamnaya, with a tiny sliver of hunter-gatherer in there. And when you look at the average Sardinian, remember, a place that was either spared or resisted the Indo-European push, you are looking at someone who is almost entirely European farmer. And if this sounds like a reach to suggest that individuals are reflective of these ancient migration events in the deep past, well, keep in mind that because the number of ancestors we have doubles every generation, as in all of us have 2 parents, then 4 grandparents, and 8 great-grandparents, so on and so forth, that people in these regions visually reflect these ancient populations for the simple reason that when you go back far enough, you are quite literally related to the entire region where you are from. And again, don't believe me, believe the math. When you go back just 15 generations, roughly 370 years, assuming 25 years per generation, which is probably a bit high, folks, you have 33,000 ancestors. And when you go back 800 years, that's 32 generations, that number hits 4.2 billion. Now, obviously, 4.2 billion weren't around 800 years ago, meaning that a lot of your ancestors are double counted, which is a polite way of saying that people married distant relatives, which, folks, is normal. And I'm not trying to normalize inbreeding here, but in the low population density pre-modern world, after you are separated by 8, 9, or 10 generations or so, people tend to forget who is related to who. No one's going to remember if you had a shared relative 250 years in the past. And this is relevant to us because when you go back far enough, simple mathematics means that you are effectively related to the entirety of whatever region your family originally came from. And so in general terms, again, emphasis on that, a Norwegian today is related to most of the population of Viking Age Norway, and to a lesser extent the broader Scandinavian population and Northern European population writ large. Listen to how David Anthony describes what I'm talking about here in his book, The Horse, the Wheel, and Language. I quote, "When you look in a mirror, you see not just your face, but a museum. Although your face, in one sense, is your own, it is also the compound of a collage of features that you have inherited from your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on. The lips and eyes that either bother or please you are not yours alone, but are also features of your ancestors, long dead perhaps as individuals, but still very much alive as fragments in you. Even complex qualities such as your sense of balance, musical abilities, shyness in crowds, or susceptibility to sickness have all been lived before. We carry the past around with us all the time, and not just in our bodies. It lives also in our customs, including the way we speak. The past is a set of invisible lenses we wear constantly, and through these we perceive our world, and the world perceives us. We stand always on the shoulders of our ancestors, whether or not we choose to look down and acknowledge them." End quote. I've uploaded 2 images, see images 9 and 10, which show lactose tolerance and the average height by European country. And folks, the higher the Yamnaya genetic presence, the more lactose tolerant and taller people are. And again, correlation, causation, and all of that. But keep in mind that the groups that replaced the majority of the populations in Europe were tall and lactose tolerant. And high Yamnaya genetic presence correlates with all kinds of things because, like David Anthony said, we are a museum of our deep past, whether or not we want to look down and acknowledge it. And big segues into the Third Reich and DNA aside, and to actually get back to our story here, when the offshoot of the Indo-European corded ware we now call the battle axe culture seized Scandinavia around 2800 BC, they thrived. On the Norwegian side of the region, their domain extended to the far north to where the modern-day Lofoten island chain is, while on the Swedish side of the region, they stopped a bit north of where modern-day Stockholm is, with everything north of these areas later being taken over by a hunter-gatherer people that still inhabit the extreme north of the region today, a people called the Sami. And these conquerors didn't know it, but they were extremely fortunate in the timing of this conquest because in 2800 BC, the climate was a lot warmer and drier than it is today. with many parts of southern and central Scandinavia having weather very similar to modern day central Germany's. And this is something that surprised me about this story because, if you're like me, you may not have been aware that temperatures were much higher in the recent past. Recent, in terms of like the last few thousand years. And now, this isn't a commentary on global warming and climate change, which are much more complicated subjects, but rather that 5,000 years ago, the world was experiencing what is now referred to as the Holocene climactic optimum. A combination of two terms here. Climactic optimum, obviously, referring to a time period with the best weather within the Holocene period, which began around 12,000 years ago and which we are still currently living in. I've uploaded two images that show this. See images 11 and 12. And if you can't pull them up, the basic gist here is that the Holocene period we are in right now is an interglacial period, which is a term that refers to a period of warm temperatures between ice ages. For context here, the last 5 interglacial periods, like our current Holocene, each lasted around 10 to 15,000 years, and we are currently about 12,000 years in ours, meaning that ours is probably going to come to an end sometime over the next few thousand years. And when these interglacial periods end, like their name implies, well, you get glacial periods, meaning ice ages. Periods of time where ice sheets advance to cover much of North America and Europe, and the Antarctic ice sheet in the south advances to almost touch the southern tip of South America. And these ice ages generally last around 50,000 years. The driver of this pendulum-like process of 50,000 years or so of ice ages and then 10 to 15,000 years of hotter temperatures are gradual changes in the Earth's orbit relative to the Sun, which goes from being more circular to more ovular every 100,000 years or so. And this, along with slight changes to the angle that the Earth rotates on its axis relative to the Sun, changes the amount of sunlight hitting the Earth. And so, going full circle here, the Indo-European battle axe culture that sees Scandinavia got really lucky in conquering the territory near the warmest time period in our current interglacial period, meaning that they conquered it during a time period when more sunlight was hitting the Earth than today, causing temperatures to be 4 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit, or 2 to 2.8 degrees Celsius, warmer than they are today. And we go down this rabbit hole because in this warm, dry weather, agriculture boomed. Like the people they replaced, these new Scandinavians engaged in a blend of farming and hunting and gathering, cultivating barley, oats, flaxseed, and some wheat, all of which were more consistently successful because of these warm temperatures which lengthened the growing season. And these people also raised sheep, cattle, pigs, and goats, and they hunted large animals like reindeer, elk, and boar, as well as seals and walrus, and small game like rabbits and birds. And they also fished, because they were sitting on one of the richest fisheries on Earth, taking salmon, herring, and cod out of the coastal waters. And then on the gathering side of things, they ate mussels, clams, and oysters, as well as root vegetables, mushrooms, berries, and honey, the latter which they used to make mead. But these new Scandinavians differed from the people they subjugated and mostly replaced in that they remained far more warlike. For example, archaeologists in the region have found thousands of Bronze Age etchings on rock walls called petroglyphs, and many of them show men with axes, spears, swords, sometimes on chariots, but most of the time on large boats. We're not talking about small boats here. These petroglyphs depict big boats capable of carrying 30-plus men. And in 1921, humanity got super lucky in finding one of these boats during an excavation in Denmark, a find which archaeologists call the Hjortspring boat. And I've uploaded images of it. See images 13 and 14. Now, while carbon dating places the Hjortspring boat's construction between 3 to 400 BC, which is almost 1,000 years after the end of the time period we're talking about here, called the Nordic Bronze Age, because the Bronze Age would end around 1200 BC, so Nordic Bronze Age being this time period that began shortly after the invasion in 2800 BC and then ending in 1200 BC, a period of about 1500 years. So while carbon dating places the Hjortspring boat's construction far after the end of the Bronze Age, this boat still perfectly resembles the Bronze Age petroglyphs that these newly arrived Scandinavians had carved during the Nordic Bronze Age. And for those that can't see the uploads, the Hjortspring boat is 62 feet long, and it weighed an estimated 1,200 pounds, meaning that it was light enough to likely be carried by its crew. And from its construction, it was clear that it was rowed like a canoe. It's not believed that rowing oars had been invented yet. And interestingly, it was made without nails, because bronze was too expensive, given that it had to be imported from the south. And so instead, the boat's planks were sewn together with a cord made from bark and leather, with the gaps between the planks being sealed with pitch, which, for those that don't know, is a sticky substance that is made from pine tree resin. Now, if you listen to the introduction episode, you'll know that I worked in U.S. naval intelligence as a civilian for several years, so I have a special place in my heart for this kind of thing. And what's really interesting about the Hjortspring boat is the fact that it is the earliest example of an advanced style of naval architecture that the Scandinavians would become famous for, which would define their shipbuilding practices during the Viking Age and beyond. Something we now call the clinker or lapstrake design, which refers to a style of shipbuilding where, instead of arranging the planks on top of one another, kind of like you might do when building a wall out of Legos, just sort of plugging them on top of one another, right? Trying to give a visual here in the sense that instead of the planks forming a flush and smooth surface, the clinker design, by contrast, overlaps the planks with one another. A good way to think about this is to try and picture in your head putting a nicely stacked deck of cards on a table and then spreading them one way across the table, where each card slightly overlaps with the other, because that is what they did with this clinker design. And then they filled in the gaps between these overlapping planks with pitch. And I know this is probably a bit confusing, so check out image 15 if you can, which visualizes this. Now, this might not seem like a big difference, but this design is absolutely ingenious because it means that when a ship hits a heavy wave or is pushed up against rocks, the hull can bend slightly before breaking because the planks overlap. And the fact that it can bend means that the hull is less brittle and less liable to break. And this is a huge deal because it means that shipbuilders could achieve a desired hull strength without relying on heavier designs. In other words, they could build a ship that was tough enough to be taken into rough currents and rapids and get hit with bigger waves while still being relatively light. And this has all kinds of advantages, like making a boat faster and giving it a shallower draft, meaning that the hull doesn't sit as deep in the water, which would enable boats to traverse more shallow rivers and creeks. And this lightweight also, obviously, makes them easier to carry over land between lakes and rivers in the ocean. Now, to be super clear, while the Hjortspring boat's unusual design matches the Bronze Age petroglyphs we talked about earlier, we don't know if this specific clinker/lapstrake hull design was created by these people during the Bronze Age. It might have been, but like many other things in this show, it's so far in the past that we just still don't know. But even with this clinker design having an uncertain date of invention, I bring it up because the fact that it was these new Scandinavians who created this advanced style of naval architecture is not surprising. This probably wasn't just luck, but rather was likely one of those necessity is the mother of invention kind of situations. Because while Scandinavia is dominated by its coasts and rivers and lakes today, it was even more dominated by them in the past. And I love the phrase that Swedish archaeologist Neil Price uses to describe the region in his book on the Viking Age called Children of Ash and Elm. He calls Scandinavia a supremely maritime environment. And it was supremely maritime. Because did you know that the entire Scandinavian landmass was far lower to sea level in the past than it is now? Because during the most recent ice age, which remember began some 100,000 years ago, Scandinavia became compressed under the weight of an ice sheet that in some places was 2 miles thick. And this titanic weight sat on top of the region for tens of thousands of years, literally pushing Scandinavia into the earth and compressing it downward, kind of like what happens when you push down on a sponge. And so, when temperatures suddenly warmed up 12,000 years ago after a major climate event called the Younger Dryas and our interglacial Holocene period began, this and other major ice sheets around the world began to melt, which caused two things to make Scandinavia look super different than it does today. First, this global ice melting caused sea levels to slowly rise roughly 180 feet over a period of a few thousand years. And while the Scandinavian landmass did begin rebounding upwards as well, kind of like a sponge does when you stop pressing down on it, it rebounded upwards far more slowly than the melting ice sheets raised the sea levels around it. And so over time, the sea levels kept on rising and rising while the land rebounded upwards more slowly, leading to a situation where the Scandinavia that the battle axe culture entered and moved into looked fundamentally different to the region you are familiar with on maps today. And I've uploaded a map which shows this. See image 16, which shows Scandinavia in 8000 BC, some 5,000 years before the battle axe culture's invasion. And for those that can't see it, folks, southern Sweden is practically an island because much of central Sweden was underwater. And Swedish archaeologists have found the remains of fishermen's huts dated to 6000 BC, which are now located 180 feet above sea level. I've uploaded another map, see image 17, that compares what the area around Stockholm looked like in 5000 BC, some 2,200 years before the invasion, to what it looked like in 1200 BC, some 1,500 years after the invasion. A lot of numbers here. The key gist is that this image will give you a sense of how much more dominated by water the landscape these people developed in was compared to Scandinavia today. And for those that can't see it, in 5000 BC, around 75% of Stockholm is underwater, and then in 1200 BC, around half the city is. And there's a hiking trail near the city with a sign denoting where the sea level was in 3000 BC, basically the same time as the invasion. And folks, this sign is now 90 feet above sea level. So this means that the ocean was 90 feet higher relative to the land in Scandinavia when the battle axe culture moved in and took over. Think about that. And the influence of this event gets a lot easier to see when one shifts one's gaze towards Norway. Because this massive ice sheet that sat on top of the region was itself made up of a system of interconnected glaciers. Because glaciers are essentially rivers of ice, still moving but very slowly, some moving only a few feet a year, some moving several dozen feet a day depending on the glacier, these titanically heavy rivers of ice carved long, deep fjords that now run hundreds of miles into the mountain chain that runs along Norway's vertical axis, a mountain chain we call the Scandies today. If you can, go look up pictures of the fjords and keep in mind that these are massive grooves carved into the earth by the power of very slowly moving but incomprehensibly heavy rivers of ice. And when this ice melted at the start of our Holocene interglacial period, the volume of water that was released carved out 250,000 small rocky islands along the Scandinavian coasts, particularly in Norway, where it created a coastal labyrinth of small islands that were later shelter boats from the heavy waters of the North Sea that were making the journey north and south along the coast. A coastal path that ultimately gave the region its name, Nordveg, meaning the North Way, which is where this podcast name comes from. And this flood event also carved out tens of thousands of lakes. In modern day Sweden alone has 95,000 of them, some of them up to 80 miles in diameter. And keep in mind, this isn't the modern day, folks. If you were to look back through a time machine at Scandinavia 5,000 years ago when the battle axe culture took over, the lakes would have been significantly larger and more numerous, and the rivers would have been wider and deeper, and the arable, farmable lands would have been smaller. And so while Scandinavia is a supremely maritime environment today, it was even more so during the Viking Age when sea levels were 15 feet higher than today, and much, much, much more so 5,000 years ago when this invasion went down. So it's not surprising that the people that lived in a world like this were the ones that would develop such an innovative ship design. Because this world that their society developed in was a literal water world. And this is something you're going to want to keep in mind for the rest of this podcast series, because one of the defining features of the Viking Age was these people's seaborne mobility, which didn't just stem from innovative naval architectures, but also the skills and abilities these people developed to survive and thrive in this supremely maritime environment. Because these people were developing in a world where traveling by boat was generally how you got around if you were going anywhere far. And so this environment transformed what had once been a pastoral nomadic people living on the steppe into a people for whom waterways were highways. A world where how far away a place was more determined by how far from the water it was than how far it was by distance. Because the Scandinavian interior is rugged. It's full of forests and swamps and bogs and huge lakes and rivers and you name it. And don't take my word for it. According to an 11th century German chronicler named Adam of Bremen, it took over 2 months to go by land from the southwestern tip where Sweden touches Denmark today to where modern-day Stockholm is. But that the same journey took only 5 days to accomplish by traveling along the coast by boat. And while the picture that we're painting here might seem brutal and austere, which it was, ironically, these people were among the richest in Northern Europe during the Bronze Age. Because starting around 2000 BC, roughly 700 to 800 years after the invasion, archaeologists find substantial evidence of Scandinavian participation in what would rapidly become a vast trade network that ran across much of Europe. It is believed the Scandinavian primary export commodity to this network was amber, which, if you don't know what that is, refers to the fossilized tree sap that everyone who has ever seen the Jurassic Park movies will be familiar with. Because in the movie, if you recall, this is the prehistoric tree sap that had the mosquito trapped in it, which they extracted the dinosaur DNA from to make the dinosaurs. You know, that thing. For context here, 44 million years ago, a vast forest had existed where the Baltic Sea is today, and resin from those trees fell down and became fossilized, and it still exists in the soil on the Baltic Sea floor and along the coasts. And because this amber is buoyant, when erosion knocks these pieces into the water, they float up and wash on the shore where they are collected by hand. And for those that don't know what amber looks like, go ahead and give it a Google or check out image 18, because it really is something else. When placed in the sun, it has like a glowing effect, and so in the ancient world of the Bronze Age, it was used in jewelry, because this was one of the few gem-like materials humanity could get its hands on at the time. The other gemstones being used at this time were things like turquoise and carnelian and lapis lazuli. And so in functional terms, this all meant the Scandinavians were sitting on top of the Bronze Age equivalent of like a giant diamond mine in the modern day. And because amber is great for jewelry because it can be easily shaped into ring settings and made into beads for necklaces, while having a sweet smell to it because it still is tree resin, it was used for jewelry in the rich metropolitan civilizations that were sprouting in the Mediterranean during the Bronze Age. Civilizations like the Indo-European Mycenaeans in Greece, whose capital city was believed to have had a population of 10,000 people, or the Indo-European Hittites in Turkey, whose capital was believed to have perhaps up to 40,000 people, or in the non-Indo-European civilizations like the Sumerians in Mesopotamia and the Egyptians, both of which who are believed to have had cities of up to 80,000 people. And these cities had an immense demand for raw materials and luxury goods. For example, archaeologist David Anthony talks about how one Sumerian clay tablet found in Iraq, dated to the Bronze Age, records the receipt of 40,000 pounds of copper bars in a single shipment. That's 1,800 kilograms, folks. And archaeologists have found copper mines dating to this time period up in the Ural Mountains in modern day Russia that have evidence of having had 6,000 tons of rock excavated from them. So, even though it might seem strange to conceptualize something like international trade during the Bronze Age 4,000 years ago, well, you have to remember that people in the past were just as smart and just as clever and resourceful as we are today, if not more so. Because they had to figure things out a lot more. They didn't have an ability to hit a button on a phone and have a cheeseburger delivered to their front door. And luckily for the Scandinavians, amber goes bad after spending too much time in the sun, because remember, it still is a plant based material, and this likely had a kind of iPhone like planned obsolescence effect, where amber jewelry had to be replaced after some time. And another demand driver for amber may have been the fact that many ancient peoples assigned magical qualities to it, because when wool is rubbed against amber, it creates a static charge. You know, the same effect that happens when you accidentally shock someone with your fingertips. And we know that the Greeks knew about this effect of amber because this is where our word for electricity comes from. Because the Greeks called amber electron, and they had all kinds of religious beliefs about amber. And the famous Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun, who was buried in 1300 BC during the Bronze Age, was buried with all kinds of Scandinavian amber jewelry in his burial chamber. And I've uploaded images of this and a few other pieces as well under images 19 and 20. And so this is how we believe these new Scandinavians got rich, exporting amber in exchange for things like bronze and gold. Because the richest burial in terms of gold quantity ever found in the Bronze Age in Northern Europe was found in Scandinavia, while more bronze swords have been found in Denmark than anywhere else in Europe. All things that had to be imported because Scandinavia doesn't have gold mines, nor sources of metal that would make bronze. And archaeologists have even found Egyptian glass, like for window panes, in this region dating to this time period. Just think about that for a second. 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, panes of glass were making their way all the way from Egypt to Scandinavia. But this very old world would grind to a halt around 1200 BC, when something caused societal collapses throughout the Mediterranean. And we don't have an exact reason for why. There are a lot of theories, some pointing to an environmental cause like a huge drought that may have caused invasions that toppled the rich, civilized Mediterranean world. Others point to the invention of iron working as maybe having played a small role, as it may have contributed to a societal disruption continent-wide by making weapons more accessible, meaning that the non-elite who couldn't import bronze swords may suddenly have been able to get their hands on military-grade weaponry that might have leveled the playing field between them and others. And this might have either caused societal instability within societies or enabled invasions by people that previously couldn't get their hands on weapons-grade technology before. Again, it's just a theory, we don't know. May have even been a combination of these things. But the important point for our purposes here is that these Bronze Age trade networks collapsed around 1200 BC. And this is apparent even in Scandinavia, where the steady tempo of rich burial sites full of gold and bronze, and sometimes Egyptian glass, disappear. And with their southern trade partners in shambles, Scandinavia became more isolated. At the same time, archaeologists ceased to find evidence of large, centralized settlements. And the combination of these pieces of evidence whispers a single overwhelming message to us across time of isolation and decentralization. And so, from an archaeological perspective, the region grew quiet for a long, long time. Not that things weren't happening or that people had disappeared, but because large, centralized settlements with rich graves full of things that don't decompose like gold or silver went away. And with that, our ability to more easily detect what was going on diminished. Because regular, everyday people generally don't have a lot of things that don't decompose. Now, this is why most museums from the deep past are full of things like knitting needles or brooches, the few small things that don't break down in Scandinavia's cold, wet soil. And this is what makes archaeology in the region after the collapse of the Bronze Age rather difficult. But then humanity got super lucky, because in the mid 300s BC, we finally get our first written account of Scandinavia. Something we'll get into in the next episode, where we'll cover the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And we'll get into that because the fall of the Roman Empire in the West is the event that not only heralds in the beginning of the Middle Ages, but which sets the geopolitical chessboard in early medieval Northern Europe in which the Viking Age takes place. Stay with me for another 20 seconds if you can for two super quick things. First, if you like this show, my biggest problem right now is that I have virtually no reach. And so the biggest thing you can do to help would be to retweet me on Twitter and to put this show in any Discord or group chats that you're in where you think folks will get a kick out of it. And second, for those that didn't listen to the introduction episode, is that I'm going to be targeting a 5-ish month release schedule, very similar to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast. So if you want to be notified, the best thing to do is to go to my Twitter/X profile and click the little notification bell icon at the top of my profile so that you'll get push notified when I drop new episodes. But you can also go to my profile on podbean.com, where for $1 a month, you can help me recoup the costs of creating this show and also add your contact info to a list that I'll update when new episodes drop. And of course, I am infinitely obliged for any and all support. And beyond this, you can also subscribe to me wherever, from Spotify to the podcast app, and I've even created a subreddit for folks that are still on Reddit. So that said, my name is Henry Holst, and welcome again to the Northway Podcast.